This is Dan Ferrisi, Editor-in-Chief with Commercial Integrator and host of the AV Plus podcast, welcoming you to AV Plus, the podcast for the commercial AV integration industry. We have a really interesting pod in store for you today. We're going to be talking all about the control room market, the operations center market, and some of the trends that are affecting those verticals. We have a great subject matter expert with us today, Shane Vega, who's Vice President of Marketing with Userful. It's all coming to you today on AV Plus.
As always, please like and subscribe to our YouTube page, and please subscribe to the AV Plus podcast on Apple and on Spotify.
Well, Shane, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your expertise. Again, you are Vice President of Marketing with Userful. You know a whole lot about control rooms, a whole lot about operations centers, and I'm grateful for you being on AV Plus to share your knowledge with us today.
Absolutely, Dan, and thank you all for having me. It's certainly a pleasure to be here.
We're happy to have you here, and I know you have a lot of information to share, particularly about those trends I referred to in the opening that are operative right now in control room spaces, those kind of mission critical environments. So why don't we get started with them? I have the trends in front of me, and I'd like you to kind of expand on them if you can. The first one being the revolutionization of control room operations, benefits associated with advanced operator workstations, AV solutions. How are these control room operations being revolutionized?
So, yeah, loaded question, right? And what I'd like to start off by saying is that we've actually begun to see these trends taking off in rest of world, right? Here in North America, where I happen to reside, we see operations centers developing and getting technology updates and upgrades, still focusing heavily on your traditional means of operation. So what does that mean? You got large scale video walls, lots of data being aggregated, lots of data being visualized to help with those mission critical decisions. What we're starting to see though is a pivot, specifically in the rest of the world and now moving into North America, where they want to now create advanced operator workstations. And that the intent of that is to ensure that your operator is fully engaged with content almost in a personalized way. So you have the ability to create personalized video walls where they're not looking at a large dashboard of information in a peripheral manner, but engaging with content directly at their operator workstations. And then even beyond that, being able to take that information and interact with it, engage with it, control, certain subsystems and the like to help with operational efficiencies, to help with workflow, response times and the like. That's been one of the biggest things that I've seen is just, again, focusing your control room or your operations centers around the workflows and allowing the technology to augment that and allowing the technology to really give your operator the experience they need to help gain those efficiencies and to help with those response times.
That element of operational efficiency, having a rapid response time, that is so critical in these environments, isn't it? I mean, when you're thinking about an operations center or a control room, this is really an environment in which seconds count. 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, to be able to facilitate that kind of efficiency, that kind of response time, it means a lot more than in some other vertical markets, doesn't it? It's especially critical here.
Yeah, I would actually say it's unique to the specific market, right? When you're in operations centers, they're 24/7, 365, they're fully operational all throughout the year. And to your point, seconds do matter. And I like to speak from a certain level of personal perspective as a father with 4 young children who are in grade school. My oldest just entered high school, and living in North America where there's been a history of violence in schools. Yet seconds do matter. And so being able to provide proactive responses and proactive data and being able to ensure the folks who are staffing those operation centers have that critical information when they need it is probably the most important thing to me and certainly paramount in those environments.
Absolutely. And there are so many different, feeds or so many different measures going on in some of these spaces. There could be 4,000 different things that there could be an alarm set on, and you're trying to monitor all of them. And when you think about those seconds, the way that I would analogize, and let me know if you think I'm wrong about this, is, they teach you in driving school that if you're going 60 miles an hour, if you're distracted for 2 seconds, how many feet are you traversing in that 2 seconds when you're distracted? And it's the same kind of thing here, where it could seem just like an instant. Oh, I turn around to let someone in or something like that. But one of those 4,000 quote unquote alarms could be going off, and it could really matter whether you happen to be away from your workstation at that moment.
Yeah, you couldn't be any more correct. That's a great analogy. I think, in these environments, and it actually opens up the door to a larger conversation around how, control rooms are being revolutionized and where the focus point needs to be. You mentioned workflow earlier, but your operator needs to be the core of that conversation, even beyond the technology. If you think about operator fatigue, to your
Mhm.
point, distractions have a bigger impact than anybody who's fatigued. If you think about your own personal response time, to use a similar analogy, when you're driving and you've been pulling an all-nighter and you're starting to get tired, your reaction time is limited because you're just fatigued.
Mhm.
And folks don't realize is choosing the right display in an operations center is critical. Making sure that you've got the right, color clarity, pixel, pitch, if you're using a direct LED wall, making sure that you don't have bezel constraints that are taking away from, the operational picture that you're trying to translate, making sure that you've got the right content and the right, aspect ratio with the right resolution, making sure the color of the paint is appropriate, making sure your lighting isn't such that it's causing headaches and fatigue, making sure you have clear line of sight, all these ergonomic discussions that go into operations centers that sometimes get trivialized are so impactful when you've got folks who are, staffed in these centers for very long days, sometimes 12 plus hours, making sure that everybody is sharp and has not just the access to the information, but the clarity and the ability to perceive and respond and decide in a moment's notice becomes critical.
There's no doubt about it. I want to move on to the next trend, which involves a buzzword or a buzz term we've been hearing a lot over the last few years, which is digital transformation and how that's being accelerated within control room environments. So I'm thinking in particular the growing role of automation technology as a means of reducing costs, as a means of improving safety, and to go back to efficiency, which we've just spent a considerable amount of time talking about, using it to increase efficiency as well. So do you want to talk about digital transformation in the context of control rooms and automation technologies and the role that they can play?
Yeah, absolutely. Digital transformation is certainly a buzzword, but it's one of the few buzzwords I think in our industry that's really gained some roots, right? And what I mean by that is organizations are actually establishing protocol processes, creating titles. I mean, they now have, chief digital transformation officers who are being hired into organizations with the exact intent of learning how to gain these efficiencies, right? And I think one of the driving factors around gaining those efficiencies is breaking down silos,
Mhm.
right? And you think about a control room or any operations center where you've got countless data sets, information coming in from all types of different systems that are traditionally siloed, and you have to be able to create these dashboards of information. That's a challenge in and of itself. But to take it to the next level where now you're trying to automate some of this response, well, that becomes challenging, right? And so when you're thinking about digital transformation in the context of an operations center, one of the first things that you want to consider, and I'm going to use this word a lot in this podcast, so I apologize in advance, is how is this going to augment and impact my workflow? Because
Mhm.
every workflow in an operations center is going to be different. And to give you some examples, you might have, a cybersecurity operations center where they're very focused. They have a very, small subset of folks, individuals who even have access to the information, and that's through nature of intent. They don't want that information going out the four walls of that operations center. Whereas, like in an emergency operations center, collaboration is critical. You've got
Mhm.
information being, distributed to wide number of different first responders, 911, dispatch, and fire, EMS, and the like, police departments. And so, the first question is, well, what is the workflow that I need to incorporate into this response? And then how do I ensure that technology is built and designed in a way where we can automate that, right? If you think about some of the most simplistic things that can be done, where I'm happen to be here in Florida, and UCF is a campus not too far from me, and they've got somewhere in the vicinity of 3,000 cameras on campus. And
Hmm.
anytime there's an active shooter or something on a campus, you'll often hear, well, we're going to subsidize the cost. The government's going to kick in some money, some grants, and we're going to make sure that we can beef up security to keep our kids safe. The very first thing people want to do is spend money on cameras. This is easy.
Right.
Let's get more cameras. And I always say the same thing. You are no more aware of what's happening on one of those cameras when there was 20 than when there's 3,000, because no one operator can, you know, uh, consume all that information in a way that allows them to make a decision. It's always reactive. Something happens, let's go back to the playback and let's see what happened and let's respond reactively. Automation triggers a proactive response. And the only way to truly become to impact automation is to make sure that those technologies can talk to each other. making sure that through APIs or through SDKs and making sure that you understand what are the systems, what is the data that you need to access? How do you ensure that you can, gain some triggers from that various different technology sets? And then how do you ensure that there's a response to that? Very simple, and you'll hear this example from a lot of folks in the industry. Something happens on camera A of 3,000 and it violates one of those analytic triggers that's in there. You can set it to change the entire status of your video wall to bring your operator's attention to just that one camera. You can take that further where you have if this, then that logic, where it's not just one parameter, but if 2 or 3 parameters are violated, then that prompts a response. That then gets folks to a place where they can really not just respond, but intelligently and strategically respond. And it gives very pertinent and definitive information to the folks who need it, and they can in turn disseminate to the folks who have to be aware of it as well, especially if you're in that EOC environment where you want to take information and send it out to police departments or otherwise. This is why I tend to believe that in the world of digital transformation, you hear a lot of talk about the future of the AV industry moving towards software, is because it helps tear down those silos and create that automation a lot easier.
So when you look at the EOCs of today, how much is this automation fully being brought to bear? Is this something that's still like an emerging opportunity to leverage this? Or is this something that really is penetrated in a meaningful way? Give me a sense of how much this is already being leveraged to deliver the kind of outcomes you're talking about.
So I think automation, as it relates to API triggers and the like, and specifically in operation centers, is not a new topic, right? The way that I'd like to address this type of a question is, it's always been available, but it's always been difficult, right? And the reason for that is like, you get a fancy smartphone, and that phone could do way more than the average person does with it, or a computer, or, and it really comes down to how much time do you want to invest in what's possible, and really take that consultative approach to understanding what needs to happen and building the system to support that. Now, in the history of this industry, because it's been so hardware centric, those silos made it a little bit more difficult to integrate and create automation triggers. Now that we're moving into a place where AV over IP is becoming the common thread, and even more so software as a defining measure of that AV over IP, it's tearing down those silos and making it a little bit easier, right? So there are companies that made a business out of, well, we're going to create those integrations for you. You'll charge us X number of dollars per integration, and we'll make sure we help you create some automation. And they do phenomenal things. The trouble is, there's always a limit to how much time and how much money you can spend. And so to use the Boston Marathon as an example, and I won't throw out any manufacturers' names in this particular podcast, but they have a tremendous system built out in Boston for security operations. Phenomenal systems are in place as the foundation, but they weren't commissioned properly. So when that Boston Marathon bombing happened, everything became reactive. They had a system in place that could have been proactive, but they didn't build it that way. And so to answer that's a long answer to your question. The simple answer is it's always, I think at this point, well over a decade or two, folks have been talking integration and automation. But I would say within the last 5 years, we've really begun to see an open door where we can create those efficiencies with a whole lot less heavy lifting, if the system designed proactively with using that as your foundation.
So let's move on to the next trend then, the third one, that being centered on the role of human-machine interfaces in improving industrial control processes. So this also traces back to enhancing operator efficiency and safety. In this case, we're talking about streamlined interactions, valuable data analytics pertaining to that role of human-machine interfaces. What might you want to say about that, Shane?
Yeah, so this takes us into an entirely different subset, right? So, I mean, for the most part, we're talking EOCs and SOCs. When you start getting into manufacturing and industrial, where PLCs are prevalent, and there's a lot of hardware in the background that has to be, analyzed, and a lot of data is being brought to the forefront. This actually dovetails very nicely to that first trend where we talk about advanced operator workstations, right? Because they've got this human interfaces, they've got machine learning and analytics, all of these things running in the background with the intent of providing a dashboard of information to help you make your decisions, where nowadays, because we have the ability to take that information, put it right up in front of an operator and give them direct, not just visualization, but direct control. right? That's one of the things that I love about Commercial Integrator is you guys like to talk beyond the AV market, right? Into the subsets of the systems beyond AV. And this is a really good segue into that world where you've got all these peripheral systems that aren't just providing data, but if you think about an electrical grid, or if you think about automation machines for manufacturing and the like, where they've got sensors and they've got information that's constantly being fed into the operators that give them alerts when they have to, either do a repair, or if something is acting, there's an anomaly and they have to send out a technician or something like that. They have that information, but more than that, they can actually begin to right then and there respond to the event by controlling those PLCs or by controlling those remote servers or getting engaged with that software, whether it's a SCADA map or whether it's some other type of software. They can begin to engage. And again, you have those operational efficiencies that are built into that process. So I think this is a really huge advantage that people should be taking, leaning towards, where you're combining those advanced operator workstations with analytics and machine learning to help with those operational efficiencies.
And again, it goes back to the point we've already made, which is that realizing those operational efficiencies is so critical. Anything that's going to minimize response time or facilitate that rapid response outcome. I mean, even if you can't necessarily preempt an issue, being able to respond in near instantaneous real time to mitigate the issue or to respond to the issue or to somehow tend to what is happening, that's the be all and end all in this category, isn't it?
No, it certainly is. And this is where having, that workflow conversation is critical. Before joining with Userful, I used to work for an integration firm. And so you have these conversations, and it was always intriguing because you get to see and hear real-time information from folks who are using these systems who are saying, no, I can't have a system that requires 3 clicks before I can do something. Mm-hmm. This is the level that they're talking about, right? Where you can't have a UI interface where you're visualizing the data, but now you have to go in and silence alarm or respond to something or take control of a remote server. And they're saying, no, three clicks is too much. I can't have that. I need immediate interaction, immediate engagement. That speaks volumes about the type of environments that we're working in.
It absolutely does. I want to move on to the next trend because it's so relevant, I think, and we're hearing so much about it these days, these evolving security threats that we face up and down the technology chain. So what are you seeing in the control space for advancing security strategies for network displays, for video walls and control rooms to try to mitigate these threats, which, as I say, are ever evolving, ever changing. The threats of tomorrow are different from the threats of today. How do we mitigate that?
Workflow. So, the biggest advancement I think that we have in the AV over IP market is our ability to engage with information and disseminate that information in a moment's notice. I like to give the example of these types of podcasts that we're having right now, where you've got an exchange of two-way video and audio. If we wanted to right now, we could begin to share content from our screens, regardless of where in the world we might be located. If you take that mindset about of what the technology in the industry affords us the capability to accomplish today, it puts us in a position where we get to be really strategic with how we deploy these solutions to help with those responses, to help with those operational efficiencies, whereby we're saying, look, you might have displays, and I'll give you a perfect example. I like to use airports as a classic example because I've spoken to quite a few airports just in the last 6 months. And it's always interesting to me that even within an airport, they have siloed operations. And so you'll talk to an airport operations center about what's happening there. And you'll start talking to them about their digital signage needs. And it's like they just know, we don't want to have that conversation. We're talking about airport operations, and this is not what we're dealing with. And then you say, but what if? What if you were able to engage your entire network of displays for emergency mass notification? Mm-hmm. What if you had an active shooter? What if you had a fire? What if you had fill in the blank catastrophe? And, right now it's showing arrival and departure or baggage claim numbers, but you wanted to say, hey, everybody shelter in place as an active shooter, or hey, there's a fire, please proceed, outside the building. Wouldn't that help gain some efficiencies in your operational, your airport operations center? Mm-hmm. And you begin to see almost like the scales falling off their eyes, right? You begin to see the light bulb going off, where it's just a matter of education. The technology that we have at our fingertips today allows us to do so much more than what we're doing in the industry. It's just a matter of being able to have these consultative discussions and make people aware that information can be disseminated in a number of ways. It could be disseminated with the screens that already exist in your enterprise or your campus. It could be distributed to remote workforce. It could be distributed to mobile devices. It could be distributed in any number of ways. And this now begins to impact how you respond. You'll find out that in a few months after deploying your system, and this is true in most scenarios that have these types of solutions in place, you're going to be changing your emergency response plans. You're going to be changing your standard operating procedures because you're going to realize, I didn't realize we can gain this much efficiency. We can respond faster if we do X, Y, or Z. And then they begin to double back and use those systems as a training exercise to help modify their response plans.
I love hearing those anecdotes about these kind of revelatory moments that emerge from these consultative conversations, because that is the root of kind of a systemic overhaul to knock down those silos and have a more holistic point of view, isn't it?
No, it certainly is. And I think in today's day and age, most of these AV solutions out there are being driven by the IT world, right? And it started usually because it's their money. Right? Usually it's the IT department that's paying for the AV infrastructure. And so they usually just want to come in and make sure, hey, are you security compliant? Are you making sure that you're not going to inundate my network with all kinds of nonsense and bog it down? But you now have a captive audience that you can begin to start talking about the things that resonate powerfully within an organization. Like, hey, did you know you can centrally manage the entirety of your infrastructure? Did you know that you can begin to create these automations and gain these efficiencies and begin to, reach out to a larger group of stakeholders without sacrificing or compromising the integrity of your network, or without sacrificing or compromising the integrity of your workflow, but actually making it better and gaining efficiencies? And when you start to use some of those triggers, central management and security are probably the two biggest ones. You realize that you've now opened up the door for a much larger conversation where folks are really engaged and they want to learn more about how they can do that.
Well, so far in this podcast, we've beat the drum on increasing efficiencies. We've beat the drum on kind of tearing down the silos. I want to continue with that with the fifth trend that you have your eye on, which involves kind of breaking boundaries and building collaboration in control rooms, particularly by means of leveraging video conferencing, real-time data sharing as a means of enhancing decision-making. Can you explain how decisions can be made better by doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. I can even give you another anecdote. So, I had a real world experience where there was a company that I worked with several years ago, and they had a very large network operations center. They had a security operations center, and they had a social media command center. And they were all active, right? They were all communicating with one another at the same time. And I started to ask the question, so how do you guys work with each other? I mean, what does a network operations center have to do with a social media command center? And this particular company was one that was a very reputable brand. And they said, well, we pay for Super Bowl commercials. And those Super Bowl commercials, as you know, are a pretty penny. They cost about $1 million a minute. And when we launched said Super Bowl commercial, we have our social media command center monitoring our brand and how it's being received by the general public. But we also have our network operations center managing the back end, because if that website goes down because of the influx of traffic that we're expecting to get during that Super Bowl commercial, that becomes a C-level escalation. Our brand takes a hit and someone's getting fired. Mm-hmm. And so you begin to see immediately just how important it is to have cross-functional, right, workflows that are impacting a larger, more diverse group of stakeholders in an organization. So then the question becomes, how do you enhance this collaboration? How do you ensure that you've got this active integration? And then what compounded that further, and you've heard this spoken about a lot, was COVID. Right, everybody went into lockdown, and everybody, and for a lot of reasons, folks just thought, well, operation centers are immune, right? Well, we have to show up there 24/7, and they even found themselves in a position where they were having to become a remote workforce very quickly. And so all of these ideas around having to keep the information in a box, that the four walls of the command center, that went away really quick, and everybody was scrambling to figure out, how do we create a secure way that we can collaborate with an extended workforce, a remote workforce. And so that just kind of became the norm. And so now you've got a lot of challenges where you're trying to figure out not just how do I interact with a global organization that's got stakeholders in multiple different countries, but even within those various regions, they've got a diverse workforce where who's at home, who's in the office, and how do you ensure that everybody has access to the information who needs it and making sure it's secure? And so these are the conversations that we're having. And thankfully, the industry does have the capability now to provide those solutions and to be able to engage a wider, diverse workforce to say, look, before it was you were in a command center, you had information, you would escalate it. Now it's you have an event, and when you're escalating the information, it's not just a verbal conversation. Sure, you can also incorporate video teleconferencing immediately to begin to engage and have those discussions with the multiple stakeholders, but you could also share the visual content during those video teleconferences, right? Because now you have the ability to share this content in real time and begin to make those active decisions when, again, you've got a diverse workforce, your executives might be in a whole different region, and everybody can be on the same page, looking at the same information and being able to make it in real time. And I think that's really what we mean when we're trying to empower those organizations to be more of a collaborative environment.
Such good points, Shane, particularly as you say, post-pandemic, we do want to make sure that everyone has a seat at the table, no matter where they happen physically to be, make sure there are no second-class citizens in essence, in terms of these collaboration sessions, that everyone has a voice, everyone's perspective can be heard, and everyone's strengths can be leveraged. So you're not, kind of undercutting yourself by virtue of having some of your top performers not able to really engage with the content just because of where they happen to be, which is incidental and should not have any impact. In terms of the last trend that we're talking about, the increasing role of AR and VR in operations centers and control rooms, just to button up the podcast, you want to talk a little bit about AR and VR in this context?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're starting to see that more and more. It used to be a niche, type of application. But because of the need for training, you see it a lot in oil and gas as an example. Also see it in the medical and health, industries where folks need to be able to really take that training to the next level, where they can get in there and not just visualize in a two-dimensional, aspect, but really begin to interact with the information. If you think about hospitals training surgeons, or if you think about oil and gas trying to understand, how they're going to extract, what they need, and making sure they're doing it in a safe manner. All of these things benefit from the ability of having AR and VR. Again, what it comes down to is, do you have the ability to visualize that content? Do you have a strategic process in place that says how and when you need to use this? And then it's not just a trigger, right? It's not just a cliche. Like when somebody says, oh, I want a 4K display, and they're just saying that because they heard it's the latest and greatest. Now I hear they're coming out with 8K. Can I have that 8K display? And it's really being able to talk people into the technology they need so that it becomes useful and relevant, and they can mature their organization, make sure the proper training is happening, the proper technology is deployed, and that they would really benefit from it. And then you build the foundation to support it when you're done.
Right. It's not about flash and sizzle. It's about delivering an outcome that is going to meet your objectives and perhaps hopefully even exceed your objectives. So it's not about buzzwords, whether it's 4K or 8K. It's about delivering the outcome for which you were there.
Yeah, 100%. And I think AR and VR has a very good place when it comes to, having something that's flashy and fancy and being used in that capacity. But when we're talking operations centers, there are very specific use cases where it should be deployed and where it actually adds value.
Well, Shane, I really want to thank you for being on the AV Plus podcast, a really informative conversation about some of the main trends affecting control rooms and operations centers this year. I feel like I've learned a lot. I know our audience has. You have any closing thoughts or anything you haven't had a chance to say?
No, not at all, Dan. I just wanted to thank you and the audience for allowing me this opportunity to speak to you guys. This is, again, a topic that's near and dear to my heart, just because of my experience, but also because I'm a family man. And so making sure that our operations centers are built correctly with collaboration at the forefront is important. So hopefully you guys all learned a little something. Again, thank you.
Here's to that. As a family man myself, I couldn't agree more. We wanted to have these outcomes to be able to be as proactive as opposed to reactive as possible, and deliver the kind of security and safety that we expect from these operations centers and control rooms. Once again, thank you so much to Shane Vega, who is Vice President of Marketing with Userful, for being here today on AV Plus. My name is Dan Ferrisi, Editor-in-Chief with Commercial Integrator and host of AV Plus, the podcast for the commercial AV integration industry. Please check back on commercialintegrator.com each and every day for more insightful thought leadership and multimedia content just like this. Have a great day.